From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we'll explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please bring the follow button on their first ever ski trip and tell them you'll start them out really easy, but as soon as you get to the mountain, immediately bring them up to a double black diamond slope, wave, and ride away. This episode is called The Birds. 60-year-old Douglas Wise knelt down inside of his garden, pulling weeds out of the small vegetable patch behind his townhouse in Queens, New York. It was August 1999, and just like every other day that summer, it was hot and muggy. Doug's shirt stuck to his back as he worked. After he finished pulling up all the weeds, he sprayed the soil with some weed killer. He paused for a moment to admire the fat tomatoes ripening on the vines he'd planted that spring. He intended to use every one of them in homemade marinara sauce. When his garden was looking neat and trim, Doug gathered the weeds into a garbage bag and then took them to the compost bin inside of his garage. Doug tried not to gag as he opened the lid. On hot days like this, the bin could smell absolutely disgusting. He dumped the weeds onto the decaying pile of eggshells and table scraps. Then, to help the composting process along, he took a bucket of rainwater he'd collected the week before and poured a little into the bin. He smiled to himself, knowing how his wife Carmen quietly hated that he collected rainwater in large buckets, but it had actually come in handy earlier in the summer when they'd gone more than a month without rain. Doug had enough water for composting and a little extra for his garden, all while being able to conserve tap water. Doug closed the bin and then grabbed a beer from the garage refrigerator and sat in a folding chair on the porch near the sidewalk. After a few hours in his garden, Doug liked to have a drink and people watch. It was his idea of a perfect Sunday afternoon. When Doug finished the last of his beer, he tossed the can into a recycling bin and headed inside for a shower. He was careful not to touch anything on his way to the bathroom. Carmen had just cleaned the house from top to bottom, and she'd kill him if she saw dirt smudges on anything. After Doug rinsed off and had some dinner, he joined his wife in the living room to watch some TV. But as he sat there, he started to feel a headache come on, and so he began rubbing his temples, and he wondered if maybe staring at the screen and straining his eyes was causing this headache. So he asked his wife to turn off the TV. But even after she did, over the next few minutes, his headache only got worse. Doug finally went to the kitchen and took some aspirin. And while that did help his head feel a bit better, his stomach now started to feel queasy. And so Doug told his wife that he just didn't feel right, and so he was going to go to bed early. He wasn't sure if maybe he ate something bad or if he was actually getting sick, like with the flu. Carmen agreed that he should just go to bed because after all, he'd spent the whole day in the yard under the beating sun. Doug kissed his wife goodnight and headed upstairs, hoping to feel better in the morning. But the next morning, when his alarm went off at 7 a.m., he was groggy and still had a headache, and his stomach still churned. Next to him, his wife had sat up, and she turned to him and said, you better get up if you don't want to be late for work. But Doug asked her to grab the phone for him because he felt absolutely terrible and he needed to call in sick. 3 days later, Carmen ladled some chicken noodle soup into a bowl, then placed it on a tray alongside a glass of ginger ale and some saltine crackers. Carefully, she carried it all up the stairs to the bedroom. Doug was in the bedroom, in bed, propped up on pillows. After 3 days of feeling totally sick, he'd lost a lot of fluids and looked very pale. As she set the tray onto the bedside table, she told her husband that she'd also bring him up a Gatorade. Carmen frowned as Doug nodded feebly. Her husband had been sick only a handful of times over the years, and when he was, it was rarely for more than 24 hours, and he had never been this weak and pale. Whatever bug her husband had caught, it had knocked him flat out. Carmen left the bedroom and headed downstairs to get the Gatorade from the fridge, and then when she had it, she went back up the stairs, and when she went back into the bedroom, she was surprised to see that Doug was not eating his soup. She asked if he was hungry, and Doug said that he was, but he said his hands were not steady enough to hold the bowl. Then he asked for Carmen's help walking to the bathroom. He said he was just too weak to get up on his own. Now Carmen was truly concerned. As she helped her husband to his feet and led him to the bathroom, she did her best to conceal her worry. Once Doug came out of the bathroom and was tucked back into his bed, Carmen asked him if he'd like her to feed him some soup. But Doug didn't respond. Instead, he just kind of stared out the window like he didn't even hear her. For several moments, Carmen spoke Doug's name with increasing urgency, but he just continued his glassy stare, saying nothing. Carmen was now terrified. She thought maybe Doug was having a stroke, so she grabbed the phone and called 911. It took a few minutes for an ambulance to arrive. While they waited, Carmen sat on the edge of the bed as Doug seemed to slip in and out of a trance, at times barely registering what was happening around him. By the time the paramedics arrived and moved Doug onto a stretcher, he was barely conscious. Carmen followed the paramedics downstairs and then out to the ambulance waiting in the driveway. She prayed silently as 2 EMTs hoisted up Doug's stretcher and secured it in the back of the ambulance. Then one of the men turned around and offered Carmen a hand, helping her into the back of the ambulance as well. Carmen took a seat on the bench, keeping one hand on her husband. As they sped towards the hospital, for the first time in her life, Carmen worried about losing her husband. Once the ambulance arrived at Flushing Hospital, Doug was rushed into the emergency room while a nurse brought Carmen to the waiting area. After about a half hour, a doctor wearing scrubs and a lab coat approached Carmen and brought her to Doug's room. Doug was lying in bed, still looking a bit out of it, with an IV hooked up to his arm. Carmen rushed over to him and kissed his forehead. The doctor told Carmen that he was fairly positive Doug had pneumonia, and if everything went well, he'd be back to normal in just a few days. Carmen squeezed Doug's shoulder, relieved to hear that he'd be okay. Later that same afternoon, the infectious disease specialist at Flushing Hospital, Dr. Debbie Asnes, was pouring herself a cup of coffee in the staff break room when her pager beeped. She checked the message and saw there was an emergency downstairs and she was needed right away. Dr. Asnes raised her eyebrows. It was unusual for the infectious disease specialist to be paged to the emergency room. If she was being called, it had to be a very unusual case that required outside-of-the-box thinking. And Dr. Asnes loved a challenge. Throughout her nearly 20 years as a doctor, she'd always been drawn to puzzling cases. She'd spent a lot of her career researching HIV, and she'd witnessed firsthand how bad things could get when doctors did not understand how a disease worked. So, without a second thought, she set her coffee down, headed out of the break room, and ran to the elevator. The moment the elevator doors opened back up on the ER floor, she could hear a man's voice carrying down the hallway. He was yelling about some strange woman standing near his bed. As Dr. Asnes approached, the ER doctor who had paged her popped his head out of the man's room and waved her in. The patient who was yelling was Doug. For the first few hours he'd spent in the ER, he'd mostly just slept, but he'd woken up in a sudden panic, and now he was yelling incoherently at the people all around him. At the same time, Carmen, his wife, was standing by his side, trying to remind him who she was. As Dr. Asnes watched this, she immediately noticed something strange. Despite being agitated, Doug's arms and legs remained still and limp on the hospital bed. The ER doctor explained to Dr. Asnes that Doug was being treated for pneumonia, but the medical team was starting to think that that was not the right diagnosis. 10 minutes ago, Doug woke up confused and agitated and didn't recognize his wife. He started flailing his arms and the nurse ran in to restrain him, but then his arms and legs just went limp, and he'd not been able to move them since. Now Dr. Asnes understood why she had been called. Pneumonia does not make people paralyzed. Doug's symptoms were far more likely to have been caused by an infectious disease, and that was Dr. Asnes's area of expertise. And Dr. Asnes was very thankful the ER staff paged her so quickly because she now suspected that Doug's confusion was likely being caused by swelling in his brain, which is very, very dangerous. Just then, Doug suddenly went silent. Dr. Asnes bent over the bed and realized he was gasping for air. Dr. Asnes said that Doug needed to be moved to the intensive care unit in case his breathing got even worse. The ER doctor agreed and told the nurse to get Doug ready to move. Within minutes, the nurse and the ER doctor each grabbed a side of Doug's hospital bed and wheeled it out of the room. As she followed Doug, Dr. Asnes turned to Carmen and asked her to stay behind until they stabilized her husband. Then, as Doug was wheeled down the hallway, Dr. Asnes grabbed onto his bed to help steer him to the elevator. She was already thinking about which tests Doug would need. A few hours later, Dr. Asnes stood in her office reviewing Doug's charts. She had ordered a test of Doug's spinal fluid because to her, something was clearly wrong with his nervous system. but she was puzzled by the results she was looking at. The test found clear evidence of a brain infection called viral encephalitis, but Dr. Asnes was not sure that was correct. Although many of Doug's symptoms were consistent with viral encephalitis, it wouldn't explain his sudden muscle weakness. And Doug's breathing problems were more severe than the doctor normally saw in a case of viral encephalitis. Before Dr. Asnes could think any further, her pager sounded, and when she looked at it, she saw she was needed again in the emergency room. So Dr. Asnes ran back to the elevator, she took it down to the main floor of the hospital, and then she began running down the hallway towards the ER. But when she was only about halfway down the hallway, a colleague came out of the ER and ran right up to her and began telling her about the emergency that she was being called to. A man named Harold Marsh had been rushed in from his home in Queens, which was not far from Doug's home, after suffering a massive heart attack. But it wasn't the heart attack they wanted to talk to her about. They were afraid the heart attack was only part of this man's problems. The colleague from the ER explained to Dr. Asnes that, like the first patient, Doug Wise, Harold, the second patient here, was older but active and healthy. His family reported that he had suddenly developed muscle weakness, flu symptoms, and worst of all, a staggeringly high 105-degree fever. Dr. Asnes felt a knot growing in her chest. Fevers that high were practically unheard of in heart attack patients. Dr. Asnes thanked her colleague and then just ordered Harold to be moved immediately to the ICU. Her mind was racing as she began to connect the dots. Two men living only blocks apart had both come down with the same mysterious symptoms in less than a week. This could be the beginning of an outbreak. For the moment, Harold was stable, so Dr. Asnes hurried back to her office to have some time to think. But as soon as she arrived on the 4th floor where her office was, she saw a nurse sprinting into Doug Wise's room. So Dr. Asnes ran down the hallway and went into Doug's room as well, just in time to see a colleague shove a breathing tube down Doug's throat and hook him up to a ventilator. The colleague, who was an ICU doctor, then explained to Dr. Asnes that Doug's muscle weakness was now so severe that his lungs had basically stopped working. Dr. Asnes was thankful her colleague had acted so quickly, but she was afraid this was only the first case of something much bigger. And if others out in the streets were contracting this virus, the consequences could be catastrophic. Dr. Asnes turned on her heel and rushed toward her office. She needed to alert the New York Health Department right away.
Imagina ese momento cuando este no borre todo el tiempo. Tal vez el destino nos puede.
5 days later, on August 27th, a medical investigator at the New York Department of Health hung up the phone in her office, wishing she'd never answered it in the first place. Her name was Annie Fine, and after a long week of work, she was ready to go home. She was knee-deep in planning her wedding, and she and her fiancé had wanted to knock out as many to-do items as possible over the weekend, but instead it looked like she would spend her weekend at Flushing Hospital. A doctor there had called in a potential outbreak on Monday, and after several days of discussions and 3 more patients in the hospital with identical symptoms, her boss had finally decided it was worth investigating. Dr. Fine reminded herself that, in all fairness, she was the on-call epidemiologist that weekend. That meant she would be responsible for any emergency that came up. But in addition, her boss and good friend, Dr. Marcy Layton, had asked her personally to help out, and she was always game to help Dr. Layton. So on Saturday morning, Dr. Fine woke up a minute before her alarm clock began screeching. She managed to turn it off before it had the chance to wake her fiancé, and then she quietly got out of bed. Half an hour later, she headed down the stairs of her apartment building and saw Dr. Layton's car parked outside. She smiled as she jumped into the passenger seat, and Dr. Layton laughed and apologized for interrupting her weekend plans. Then Dr. Layton handed Dr. Fine a cup of to-go coffee, and they peeled off toward Flushing Hospital. After a short drive, Dr. Fine and Dr. Layton parked near the hospital and climbed out of the car. As soon as Dr. Layton had stepped onto the curb, she made a disgusted noise, and Dr. Fine turned to look at what she was disgusted at, and she saw there was a dead crow lying in the gutter right near Dr. Layton's feet. Both doctors had been seeing dead crows all over New York that entire summer. So they both just walked around the dead bird, and the two women headed for the hospital. Right outside the ICU, the two doctors were greeted by a tall, thin man wearing a lab coat. He told Dr. Fine that he was the chief resident, which meant he was a doctor in training, standing in for Dr. Asness, who was out of town on a family emergency. He explained that in the 5 days since Dr. Asness first called the Department of Health about her first two patients, 3 more people had been admitted to Flushing Hospital with symptoms of viral encephalitis. All 5 were older people who were previously healthy and active. Most worrisome, all 5 also had other symptoms not normally caused by viral encephalitis, including fever, stomach pain, confusion, muscle weakness, and severe difficulty breathing. The chief resident added that all 5 patients had declined really quickly. 4 were now on ventilators, and the 5th was not, but they were delirious with pain. Dr. Fine felt unnerved. All of a sudden, wedding planning was the last thing on her mind. There were usually only about 10 viral encephalitis cases every year in all of New York City. But now, one small neighborhood in New York City had 5 cases in less than a week, and so far, nobody had figured out why. Dr. Fine asked the resident to go collect blood samples from each of these patients and submit them for additional testing. In the meantime, she and Dr. Layton would interview the patients' families and anyone else who was with these people in the week leading up to their hospitalization. The resident nodded and then led Dr. Fine and Dr. Layton to an empty conference room where they could call people and interview them. Dr. Layton would ask the questions and Dr. Fine would take notes. By that afternoon, Dr. Fine's writing hand was totally cramped. She spent hours taking notes as she and Dr. Layton spoke with the patient's family members. Outside, it was starting to get dark, so Dr. Fine rolled her chair toward the wall and switched on the overhead lights. The conference room table was littered with textbooks, stacks of medical journals, and reports on annual encephalitis cases in New York. Dr. Fine looked over at Dr. Layton and sighed. Despite hours of interviews and poring over the patients' files, they still did not know how these 5 patients in Flushing Hospital had contracted encephalitis. But they had found that all 5 patients had 2 things in common. First, that they all lived within a few square miles from one another in Queens, and second, they all loved to spend time outdoors in the evenings. A few of the patients, like Doug Wise, the first patient, would work in their gardens until nightfall. Others just liked to watch the sunset from their back decks or take long walks along the East River after dinner. Dr. Fine looked out the window as the street lamps flickered to life, and right as they did, it hit her. People were not the only ones who loved summer evenings. It's also the time when mosquitoes are at their most active. All 5 of their encephalitis patients were probably swatting away mosquitoes as they gardened or walked or gazed at the sunset in the gathering darkness each night. And Dr. Fine knew something else about mosquitoes. They spread disease. Diseases like encephalitis, a condition that often strikes older people like Doug and Harold more frequently. Dr. Layton was intrigued by Dr. Fine's idea, but she was cautious. If mosquitoes really were spreading some new virus to people, they should be able to find mosquitoes infected with the disease. And so until they were able to isolate the virus in mosquitoes, then Dr. Fine's idea was really just a theory. Before the doctors left the hospital that night, Dr. Fine wrote up an alert that Dr. Layton sent to all the neighboring hospitals, asking them to report any cases of viral encephalitis to the Department of Health. That way, she and Dr. Layton would know if the virus was spreading. 2 days later, on the morning of September 1st, Dr. Fine sat at her desk, twisting her pencil in her hands. She was back in her office, feeling frustrated by the lab results she had just read. That morning, she and Dr. Layton had sent a small team to northern Queens, where all these patients had lived, And the job of this team was to canvass that neighborhood and visit the houses of each encephalitis patient and try to find breeding mosquitoes. Well, that team collected several samples of mosquito larvae from standing water around the neighborhood, but none of those mosquitoes were infected with viral encephalitis. Meanwhile, Dr. Fine was still waiting for lab work to come back on the blood samples she'd collected from the 5 infected patients. While Dr. Fine thought about what she should do next, Dr. Layton knocked on her door. She said she had bad news. One of the encephalitis patients, Harold Marsh, had grown so weak that the doctors determined he would not recover. Moments ago, the family had decided to take him off life support. Dr. Fine's heart broke for Harold and his family. She was frustrated that she couldn't even tell them for certain what had killed their loved one. It felt like they were back at square one. But at the very least, Dr. Fine knew that the doctors at Flushing Hospital would be able to do an autopsy and take tissue samples they couldn't get while Harold was alive. Dr. Fine hoped that these samples could help them identify the virus and warn the public at large. The following morning, Dr. Fine walked into her office to find her boss, Dr. Layton, waiting for her with news about Harold Marsh's autopsy tissue samples. Tests indicated that Harold had died of something called St. Louis encephalitis, a very rare strain of the disease that's only spread by mosquitoes. Dr. Layton said that federal health officials had also checked the blood samples from the other 4 encephalitis patients in Queens, and they found that they too had tested positive for St. Louis encephalitis. All 5 of the patients had gotten sick from mosquito bites. Dr. Fine frowned. On the one hand, it was nice to know that her theory that mosquitoes could have caused this was in fact what caused this, but this diagnosis didn't really make sense. The patient's symptoms were all consistent with St. Louis encephalitis, but there had never been a reported case of St. Louis encephalitis in New York City until now. In fact, there were only about 30 reported cases a year in the entire United States, and these were almost exclusively in southern swamplands. Dr. Fine wondered if infected mosquitoes had somehow migrated north. But if they had, there would have been cases of it in other places along the eastern seaboard, and so far, the only cases of it were from this outbreak in Queens. Something just didn't add up. Dr. Fine told Dr. Layton that she was glad they finally knew what was going on, but deep down, she still could not shake the feeling that there was something off about this diagnosis. A few weeks later, Dr. Fine was in her office at the Department of Health when Dr. Layton knocked on the door. When she came in, she had a very serious expression on her face. Dr. Layton explained that she'd just gotten off the phone with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, and Dr. Fine's suspicions were correct. The virus they were investigating was not actually St. Louis encephalitis. It was much worse. A pathologist at the Bronx Zoo, of all places, had figured out the mistake. She'd been trying to understand why all these birds were dying all over the city, and she had discovered that they were actually contracting some form of encephalitis. And then after she learned about the St. Louis encephalitis outbreak in the city, she began to investigate whether that was what was killing all these birds. But tissue samples from the dead birds showed no sign of St. Louis encephalitis. Instead, the birds had a different strain that can easily be confused with the St. Louis strain, but it's actually much more dangerous. And the birds were loaded with this different strain. In fact, the birds got this strain of encephalitis at such a high concentration that a mosquito sucking their blood could pass on the disease to the next creature it bites, including humans. And sure enough, when the CDC retested the blood of the patients at Flushing Hospital, they found that they too had the same strain of encephalitis as the birds. This strain is known as West Nile virus. West Nile is something that likely lots of people have heard of, but it's actually even more rare than the St. Louis strain, at least in the United States, because until this point, it had never been seen in the United States. It was only really seen in Africa. The CDC suspected that an infected mosquito from some other part of the world had found its way onto a plane maybe, and then come to the US that way, or maybe a sick bird had gotten onto a boat, and that's how the disease came to the United States. But now that this disease had crossed the ocean and arrived in the US, Dr. Fine knew it was here to stay. By the time the CDC put the puzzle together, as many as 1,900 residents of northern Queens were infected with West Nile virus. 62 people landed in the hospital, and 7 people died that summer in 1999 before the mosquitoes disappeared with the fall. And in the years since those initial cases, over 56,000 people have been infected in the United States. 2,776 have died as of 2022. Although the mortality rate of St. Louis encephalitis and West Nile is comparable, West Nile is far more dangerous. Because it can be carried by birds, West Nile has spread to all 50 states, while St. Louis encephalitis remains fairly localized and far less common. Doug Wise, the first patient to come in with West Nile, remained in Flushing Hospital for several weeks before he was healthy enough to transfer to a physical rehabilitation facility where he stayed for the next month. By spring of 2000, Doug was able to walk with the assistance of a special cane, but his left side never regained its former strength, and he continued to suffer episodes of short-term memory loss. But ultimately, Doug knew he was one of the lucky ones from that painful summer of 1999. He could at least still tend to his garden as long as he wore his mosquito repellent. 1955, Catherine Knight had the misfortune of being born into a highly dysfunctional and abusive household. Not only was she badly mistreated by her alcoholic parents and cruel older siblings, she was also scorned by the people who lived in the town with her simply because they didn't like her family. Catherine lived in a very small town in New South Wales, Australia, where basically everybody knew each other's business. But despite the abuse, Catherine always tried to focus on the future. She would tell herself that as much as my life is miserable right now, in the future I will have a family of my own and I will take care of them the way I wish my family had taken care of me. But when Catherine became a young woman and began dating men, all of her relationships would always crash and burn because inevitably she and her partner would become toxic and abusive and it would end the relationship. It was like Catherine both didn't know how to be a quality partner and didn't know how to identify a quality partner, likely because she didn't know what that looked like. She had been raised in this horrible household. But in 1995, when Catherine was 40 and really starting to feel desperate for someone to actually love and to love her back, she would meet a man named John Price, who was also 40, and he just seemed fundamentally different than every other man she had ever dated. He was empathetic to her troubled past, and he seemed to really care for her and really wanted to kind of take her under his wing and love her. And so immediately Catherine just fell head over heels in love with John, and in return it seemed very much like John had fallen head over heels in love with Catherine. That year, Catherine moved in to John's house where he lived with his 3 young daughters, who right away took a liking to her. And so for the first time, Catherine felt like her life was really going the way she wanted it to go. But unfortunately, this would not last. Despite the seemingly perfect start to Catherine and John's relationship, it eventually began to sour when Catherine began to ask John if they were ever going to get married. Catherine really wanted to get married. She wanted to kind of officially have a family of her own that she could take care of, but John was weary of marriage because he had just left a failed marriage, and he told Catherine that realistically, he might never want to get married again. And so over time, this issue really drove the two apart, and it all came to a head in early February of 2000 when John and Catherine were at his house. They were in the kitchen and they got into a heated fight over marriage, and then before long they were both getting physical with each other. And during this altercation, Catherine kind of scrambled and grabbed a knife on the counter and actually slashed John across the chest. And as soon as she did this, the fight came to an end. John screamed at her to leave the apartment and never come back, but Catherine was already storming out of the apartment. They both understood that a line had been crossed, and almost certainly their relationship was now over. But over the following days and weeks, Catherine, who had moved into a different apartment at this time, kind of near where John was living, she felt very lonely, and even though she knew her relationship with John was not a healthy one, she longed to patch things up with him. She didn't like being alone. She wanted to have that family. And so she decided she would do what she had previously done in other relationships, kids to kind of patch up the relationship after a fight. And so the way she would do this is she would kind of make sure they had the house to themselves, and then she would show up in lingerie and they would have kind of an intimate makeup moment, and then everything would go back to normal. So on February 29th, Catherine waited until she knew John had left for work, and she went over to his place, and she had a key to it still, and she went inside and his 3 daughters were there. And so Catherine said hello and she chatted with the kids for a minute, and then she made arrangements for the 3 kids to go get picked up by a babysitter and spend the night outside of the house. And so then when the babysitter came by the house and picked up the 3 girls, Catherine said goodbye to them, and then Catherine left John's place and she went out to get her lingerie. Later in the evening, when John came back to his house, he went inside and he found his kids weren't there, but there was a note from Catherine that explained where his kids were and how she wanted to make up with him and she would be back in a little while. Now, John was not happy about this. He was angry that she had decided to just come into his house without asking him. That felt very violating. And then also she made a decision about his kids without talking to him. That just felt so offensive and wrong of her to do. And so John grabs a beer out of the fridge, he sits down in the living room, and he begins to wait for Catherine to show up. The next morning at 6 a.m., John was supposed to be at work already, but he wasn't. And so his company, who knew he was very reliable, were concerned something was wrong. And so they sent a worker to his property to see what was going on. And so the worker, he pulls up in front of John's house. John's car is in the driveway. And so the worker's first thought is, oh, I guess John must have overslept. And so the worker walks up onto John's front porch and he knocks on John's front door, but there's no answer. And so the worker knocks again, still no answer. And so this guy turns around to leave and go back and tell the company, look, I don't know what's going on. But as he's turning around, he notices on the very bottom of the outside of the door, kind of near the edge, the front edge of this door, there looked to be some blood on the outside of the door. It was pretty easy to tell it was blood. And so the worker was immediately very concerned and he knocked again on the door, but no answer. And so he ran around to the side of the building and he began banging on the windows of John's house to hopefully rouse whoever was in there to come out and to make sure things were okay, but there was silence. And so the worker ran back to his car, he drove back to his office, and after he told his boss what he had found, they decided they had to call the police. The police would show up at John's residence at 8 a.m., and when they got there, John's vehicle was still in the driveway, the house was quiet and dark, and so the police, they walked up to the front door, they knocked on the door, there's no answer, it's silence, and so they walk around to the back of the property to try the back door, and as they're walking into the backyard, they see in the middle of the grass, right behind a window that led into the house, there was this plate of food that had been clearly thrown out of the house and landed face down on the grass. And so the police see that, they're thinking that's pretty weird. And so what they do first, before even going to the back door, is they turn to the window, which clearly the food had been thrown out of, but whoever had done it had then shut the window. And so they go over to the glass and press their faces up against it and peer inside. And there's no John, there's no people, there's nothing inside, it's dark. But right inside of this window is this big dining room table, and it's covered with this amazing spread of food. It looks like a Thanksgiving Day meal had been prepared, but then no one had eaten from it. And so they're thinking, okay, well, for whatever reason, one of these plates of food was thrown out the window. That's very odd. And so the police come off the window, they walk over to the back door, they knock a few more times, but after even more silence, they kick the back door down and they go inside. As soon as they step in, there's 2 officers. They walk straight into the house with the dining room table with all that food on their left, and there's nothing that stands out. They're calling for John, it's silent, everything is off, everything is quiet, and they keep on walking into what appears to be the living room where the TV is and where there's a couch, and as soon as they walk in, they see there's blood everywhere. And towards the front of the living room, where the front door actually opened into the house, there was a very obvious pool of blood. Basically, if you stepped into the house, you'd be stepping into this puddle of blood. And as they're looking at this pool of blood, they see there is a distinct blood trail from the pool back into the living room that they have just walked into, and the trail kind of leads behind a couch out of their view. And so they walk around the couch to see what's at the end of this trail, and they find Catherine Knight's crumpled body on the ground. And so right away they rush over to her and they feel for a pulse, and they discover that she actually does have a pulse, but very obviously she's clinging to life, barely. And so one of the officers stays with Catherine while they're calling in paramedics to come in and deal with her, while the other officer draws their weapon and they begin searching the rest of the house. And so the officer walks past the front door on their left, and they go into the other side of the first floor, which is basically like this lounge room, kind of like a secondary living room. And as they're looking out across this room, they see there's no one in it, but there appears to be this curtain blocking the entrance to some other side room. And this officer, as they're looking at it, they look down and they notice there's another blood trail that starts from the front of the house. It snakes all the way across this lounge room and kind of disappears into this covered up room. And so this officer yells out for John, but there's no answer. And so he ends up going all the way across, checking as he's going, looking around, but there's no one there. And he gets to this towel, and with his non-shooting hand, he kind of pushes it out of the way, and he looks inside of this space. And it turns out to just be a small closet. There was nothing of note inside. It didn't really make sense that the blood trail had led to this closet. But then, as the officer was kind of wondering why the blood trail ended here, he started to feel something cold on his non-shooting arm. And so he looked down at his arm, and he saw there was this huge streak of blood on his arm. And he knew he had not been wounded in some way. This was not his blood. So how did he get blood all over him? And then he stepped back in horror, because he realized the curtain that he had just moved with the arm that had blood on it was not a curtain. The night before, John sat in his living room waiting for Catherine to return, very angrily waiting for her to come back. But by 11 p.m., she hadn't. And John, he works super early in the morning. He's very tired. He decides to just go to bed. And so he climbs into bed, he falls asleep. And then about an hour or so later, Catherine would walk into the bedroom. She had her black lingerie on that she had bought earlier in the day. And even though John was furious with her and very upset with what she had done that day, seeing her like this suddenly made him think, you know what, all my issues with her can wait. And before long, they were getting intimate together in the bed, and then they fell asleep in each other's arms. Later in the night, Catherine would wake up. John's still fast asleep, so she's looking right at him, and she suddenly has this intense sense of disgust. She was convinced that he was taking advantage of her, that the reason he didn't want to marry her was he was just kind of using her. And this anger inside of her boiled up, and she decided right then and there that I need to teach this man a lesson he will never forget. And so Catherine very quietly slipped out of the bed. John's still sleeping. She snuck out of the bedroom. She made her way out of the house, and she got into her car, and she drove across town to the apartment she had been staying in for the past couple of weeks, and she grabbed her work tools. Catherine, where she worked full-time, was a meat processing factory, and she worked on the kill floor with the animals that are being turned into meat. And so her skill set was butchering, and her tools were butcher's knives. And so she grabs her kit of butcher's knives, and she drives back to John's place. She goes into the house, she makes her way into the kitchen, and she unrolls this kit full of different sized butcher knives, and she picks the one she wants, she pulls it out, she makes sure it's nice and sharp, and then she made her way into John's bedroom. When she got into his bedroom, John was still asleep. He was lying on his back, covers up over him, fast asleep, and she climbed onto the bed, being very careful not to wake him. And then when she was straddling him kind of on her knees right over his midsection, she raised the knife up between her two hands, and she brought it down into his chest. John immediately shot up, bucking Catherine off of him. She went flying onto the floor, and then instinctively, John just begins running out of his bedroom. He has no idea what's happening. He's been stabbed, but he probably can't even feel it. It's all adrenaline. He is just running through the house. But by the time he gets to the front of the house, the blood loss had caused him to be so weak he could barely stand. And so he managed to open the front door, but then he collapsed onto the ground halfway between the inside and outside of the house. And so laying there, he reached out with his bloody hand, and he grabbed the edge of the door that was partially open and tried to pull himself out of the house. And that's how that bloody print was left on the outside of the door that the worker saw. And as he's trying to pull himself out of the house, Catherine, who had gotten up after being knocked off the bed, she ran to the front of the house, and she grabbed his legs, and she pulled him back into the house and then shut the door. And then once he was inside, she got on top of him and stabbed him an additional 36 times all over his body. And then she left him there to bleed to death. And so while he's dying, she goes into the kitchen and she puts on a large pot of water to boil. And then she began setting the plates all around the dining room table for a big family meal. After she was done setting the table, she went back over to John, who was now deceased at this point, and she dragged him all the way across that lounge room on the other side of the house that the officer walked through and then found that curtain. She dragged him all the way across that room to right in front front of that closet, and then using her expert skills from working in the meat factory, she proceeded to skin John from his neck all the way down to his toe. And she was so good at it that she was able to skin him in one piece. And she took this skin suit and she draped it over the entrance to this closet. And then she removed John's head from the now skinned torso, and she placed it in the water that she had put on to boil earlier. She was going to use his head to turn it into some sort of broth or gravy. And then she grabbed his skinned torso and dragged it into the kitchen and began butchering it and then making different dishes with his meat, different pies and casseroles. And then after she had made this enormous feast out of John's body, she set the food all around the table that she had already laid out, and then she made little placards, little name cards that had the names of each of John's children on them, and she placed them in front of each of the plates because her intention was to feed them their father. And then Catherine sat down at a plate that she had made for herself, and she began eating John, except it made her sick, and so she opened the window behind her and she threw her plate of food out into the backyard. And then when she turned back around and looked at what she had done, she decided that instead of facing the consequences, she would just take her own life. And so she went into the bathroom, she grabbed some sleeping pills, and then she cut across the front of the house, walking through that pool of blood near the door. She made her way into the living room, she overdosed on sleeping pills, and collapsed on the ground. However, when the paramedics finally showed up the following morning, they were able to save her. And so once she stabilized in the hospital, she was promptly arrested for John's murder. She would ultimately be found guilty. However, she would never take any responsibility. And then during her sentencing phase, she was given life in prison, but the judge made a special clause just for her. He told them that her file needed to be stamped, literally stamped, never to be released. Basically, there was no hope ever of her getting out of prison. And so after she was taken away, she would become the first woman in Australian history to be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She is still alive today. So that's going